What motivates people sexually? And what does sex mean to you? How do you find sexual confidence?
I'm Candice. My background is in social work as well as psychosexual therapy.
I'm Arlen. I'm clinical nurse consultant and a psychosexual therapist.
You're listening to Have the Nerve, a podcast by Spinal Cord Injuries Australia. And in this episode, we talk about sex, disability, and sexual identity with psychosexual therapist Candice Kerr Unger and Arlen Owens from Royal Rehab in Sydney.
I've been with Royal Rehab now for nearly 16 years. So for the last decade or so, I was with the New South Wales Spinal Outreach Service as well. And before that on the wards, the spinal unit and spinal unit up in Brisbane as well. And then before that at Paracord. So I've done the rounds of both our NGOs and our health-funded services.
I've got a background in sexual health nursing, primary health, critical care nursing. Before that, when I was a nursing student, I was a disability carer for about 3 or 4 years, working with spinal and brain injured clients mostly.
What has led you to focus on sexuality specifically?
So I remember it was a very specific moment. I was working for Spinal Outreach Service, doing an initial assessment with a lovely guy and his partner, and he'd only been home for a couple of weeks after his admission, and they naturally wanted to ask a bit about sex and sexuality, what was kind of not working for them at the time. And I felt like at that point, I remember sitting in their kitchen and having like the medical story to tell, but they were actually looking for non-medical intervention. Like it wasn't just about penetrative sex. And I remember kind of looking around the network at the time, and we had heaps of options for fertility. We had heaps of options for like functional intervention. And it was well before I knew anything about sexology and sex therapy as a whole discipline. And I just remember feeling so inadequate. So nothing makes you feel like an incompetent clinician than realizing you have absolutely nothing to offer. And I completely understand why it's a topic that a lot of people don't really want to talk about, because you don't want to open up that box and then feel like you've got nothing to offer somebody. So that was probably the personal catalyst that made me think, you know what, we can do better. I can probably do better, and started looking for ways to retrain and to kind of gain that knowledge. So I enrolled back at uni and did like the sexual health and reproduction post-grad study. That was definitely the moment where I just thought, we've got to do better. We owe the community better, and there's knowledge out there. We just kind of need to marry it into rehab.
I guess for me, going into sex therapy in general is following a bit of a dream for me. I guess I've always been a bit of a sex geek since I was a teenager. Since I was a young kid, my mother was a sexual health nurse, and I always followed it in interest. As I was nursing, I kind of got, in the hospital system especially, I got really sick of how there was a lack of person-centered care, and people just weren't really treated like individuals, and there's a lot of trauma that happened in the hospital. And so I kind of wanted to free myself from that. I wanted to work for myself, and so I decided to follow my interest into sex therapy. I developed a really strong interest in sort of folks that kind of get forgotten and slip through the cracks in health or just in the world, and marginalized folks, and that was kind of my focus in sex therapy. It got to a point later when I ended up in a primary health and sexual health clinic in the Cross with some really marginalized clientele, where I really started to decide I wanted to stay a nurse, because I thought, wow, look, it can be done. Like, we can be really person-centered as nurses. But there was no service where sexuality was really handled in a professional way. And then Candice started this service, and I thought, amazing, I can be a sex therapist and a nurse. And I think in terms of disability, folks with disability are really often forgotten about in terms of sex. It's very, very able-bodied, and, you know, it's cisgendered, it's heteronormative. Here's kind of a really big opportunity for me to work in this service and have a big impact in a sex-positive way.
You were talking, Candice, about how you did sexual health as a post-grad study, and that's where you and Arlen met. When you're doing sexual health as a study unit, do they focus on disability at all?
Oh no, this is like, I only laugh because I gave my, feedback. There's some parts of the course that are absolutely wonderful, but considering, like 1 in 4, 1 in 5 people have a disability in Australia, it's a massively missed opportunity for just making that new generation of sexologists really disability aware and competent, and also it just makes good business sense too. Like people who are coming out to work in this space are missing a whole population that want and need and will pay for services. So there's an element there that I think is missing, but I'm sure it'll be in the next kind of 12 months to 24 months, it'll be a different story again.
As we've seen since we started the service and bringing in our interventions and our skills that we've gained through our education in sexology, like a lot of it kind of relies on able-bodied sensation and mobility, and we've really had to use our creativity to kind of apply it. Like they do work, but you have to adapt to a lot of things, and that education about how to adapt it was not really in our training.
Royal Rehab started the sexuality service in January 2021. Although medical intervention was always there, a specific sex therapy component was included under a PLISSIT model.
So PLISSIT stands for permission, limited information, specific suggestions, and intensive therapy. And so the philosophy is that all rehab clinicians should be comfortable to give permission, that we should be able to meet a newly injured person or someone further down the track and help send the message that you're still a sexual being. And that would include just asking about, have you noticed any changes in your sexuality or your sexual function post-injury, and is there anything you'd like to talk about? So that's sort of permission giving. The sexuality service is really focused at that specific suggestions and that intensive therapy. I think society has sort of accepted that sex is part of life and that we can talk about this and that we should talk about this and that it is an integral part of rehab. For at least the last 3 decades, the literature has been talking about rehab should be addressing sexuality. If you meet somebody who's newly injured, and I guess the types of questions that might be coming up, and you would be able to speak to this better than I will be, but it's kind of things like, is it possible? How am I going to do it? If they're not in a relationship, will anyone want to be with me again? I feel like confidence takes a massive knock. And then if they're in a relationship, will the person leave me? Will it be too hard? Like, are we even strong enough and united enough to get through this? And some people just need to reevaluate, maybe that person isn't the right person for me for the rest of my life, and should we go through this hard thing together right now? So and I'm sure you've heard this before, hey, like people talking about massive identity impact a spinal cord injury has.
Depending when people are referred to our service along their life after their injury, whether it's lifelong or a traumatic injury, people kind of engage in therapy a little bit different. So if we get into that early intervention, we see people, say, when they've had a traumatic injury and they come straight out of hospital, they've got a whole lot of stuff that they're dealing with in their life. Often we don't, unless they're really motivated for it, we don't really get a lot of long-term intensive therapy, but we do a bit of early stuff. We get them thinking about it and get that hope in. Whereas we also get people that are 10, 20, maybe 30 years down the line or lifelong, and they can, they've got their life more or less in order, but they need a little bit of assistance with that. So we tend to do a lot more work over time.
I think Google is a friend here, like most people are on the internet and working stuff out for themselves, and they're Googling stuff, and there's some great resources online and some fabulous, particularly out of the US, lots of really free and open information. So I think, yes, we see people who are quite a while down the post-injury, and a lot of them have been working it out, on Google. When people are ready, how people are ready, it's an individual story. If the message that can be given at those early days is that hope piece. Sexuality is a broad, expansive thing. It's an important part of your quality of life. Don't think, now I'm to become a monk or a nun, or my life of celibacy is here. Build hope that sex post-injury is possible, pleasure is possible. It might look different, but it's still going to be amazing.
That's a huge part for folks with disability after spinal injury, is that there's a big self-worth piece. So we're addressing ableism in our world. So it's not just sex, but it's everything else. So that all comes into it. We mentioned sex education in school. It's very limited for able-bods, let alone for disability. A lot of our work is to try to unpack that script of genital-focused sex. So if you've got some functional change, you think it's all gone, but sex is in the brain and sex is in your body. So, and you can feel pleasure. And so we're starting to try to create a new script for what sex looks like.
I had a client just recently got his driver's license back. He's working again. You know, the kids are grown up now. Like this, if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, all the kind of basic stuff is sorted. His life's good. Like every year it gets a little bit better, but this is the cherry on top. And so I just felt like that analogy has really just stuck with me. I mean, like, yeah, like when people are ready to address this, it can be the cherry on top.
We have a lot of listeners as well who, even though know people who have spinal cord injuries, other neurological disabilities, they actually don't know anything about sexual function and SCI.
I think the first thing I just want to say, and then I'm going to let Arlen take over, is that sex is in the brain. So the brain is the major sexual organ. And I think the biggest misconception is that if your genitals aren't doing something, that it's over. So that for me is the biggest misconception. Sex is not in the pants, it's in the head.
It all comes out in the shoulds, the way that things should be. We look at gender, we look at sexuality, there's heteronormativity, we've got binary gender expression. It's all these social expectations for how things should be. And I think if we link that back to like injury level in spinal cords, like I'm sure your listeners would know that like you could have two people with a C5 injury, but their function, their sensation, everything is very different. I mean, we can kind of look at what someone's level of injury, their diagnosis is, but they're going to be both very different. It might give us a vague guide to what's likely to be going on, but we really don't know until we see that individual and work with that one person and what's happening in their body.
I think too much of our education has come from porn, television. You know, Hollywood has sort of created this ideal, like, you know, sex is spontaneous, sex is for hot, good-looking, fit folk, and that it is, you know, always great. Like, and the reality is sometimes it's fumbly and clumsy and awkward, and you're like, gee, I kind of have like some, wish that didn't really happen like that, but you know, it's just sort of part of, it's messy. Oh, it's so messy, and people think it's going to be clean and tidy, and it's not. So I think just coming back to what are the major issues after spinal injury, the spinal cord is what helps our bladder, bowel, sexual function sort of respond. And so depending on where somebody has their injury, it will completely depend on what sort of issues they might have. I mean, every single person's injury is going to affect them differently. And there's no like magic science of like an MRI isn't going to tell us what does and doesn't work. So we know that there is like, you know, the upper motor neuron injuries and the lower motor neuron injuries, and they can either keep like psychogenic arousal intact or reflex arousal intact. But, you know, this becomes really technical and kind of, it becomes very specific to that person with the injury, because there may be an incomplete injury and then things that you don't think are possible. And I think the most unhelpful thing people can hear is that sex post-injury is over, or your sex life's done. We talk about this nocebo effect. So the more you're told you're going to have an erectile dysfunction, the more you will have an erectile dysfunction. And the same for like women, like the more you're going to have an orgasm disorder, the more you're going to have an orgasm disorder. So I think we kind of need to make sure that we check the messages that are coming to us. Are they explicitly being told? Did some surgeon say after your injury you'll never walk again, and then a few months later you've got flickers? Well, it's the exact same kind of translates into sex. Like, did somebody say you'll never have sex again? Or was that rubbish movie that you watched that you didn't even realize that you took that message internally? And there's some movies that just make me want to scream because the message is so inappropriate and doesn't help the community in building any sort of actual awareness of life post-injury.
I guess this kind of goes hand in hand with like what we were talking about, inadequate, not just sex education with disability, but disability education to the wider community, and how that actually fosters stereotypes and a bad overall society relationship between themselves and people who have disabilities.
You can summarize it by calling it ableism, but you know, to unpack that, that's a whole other lecture. I think it's more about really checking the social scripts, like, you know, how much has society told you something, and where did you learn that, and how does it help you? Does it serve you? How can you unlearn it? I think is a big part of what happens in intensive therapy. It's, what did you get told as a kid growing up by your parents? What did your religion tell you about, I mean, if we're going to narrow in on sex, you know, but What does your culture tell you about sex? What does your religion tell you about sex? What were the messages that were unspoken around the house? Like, were your family a nudie Rudy house, or were they a completely closed on, conservative family? And I think all of these unspoken messages come into the way that we see ourselves sexually. And some of us need to fight harder than others to kind of crack through that.
Yeah, it's expanding that script. So I guess we're looking at like what is sex and what can people do? What can you do for a partner and what can you do for yourself? And I think after a spinal injury, often people don't even know that they themselves can feel pleasure. So we do a lot of exploration, and we need to find what feels good. This is a question I always ask in sessions and tell health workers to do in our trainings, is ask your clients what feels good. Because we need to explore that. And then once we know what feels good, we can expand on that and we can explore with that.
And also what was happening before their injury. To think that sexual difficulties happen after injury and that's the only time they happen, well, that in itself is a mistake, because there's a huge part of the population that have sexual difficulties and they don't have a spinal injury. Whatever performance anxiety somebody had before, well, that's not going to miraculously go away with a spinal injury. And any underlying diabetes, cardiovascular disease, sexual function is really the pinnacle of overall healthy, kind of how healthy somebody is. If they've got lots of underlying issues, then that's not going to help either. So I think it's a bit of the assessment needs to include what was happening before the injury, because spinal injury doesn't magically make that change.
My whole intention for this sort of conversation and future conversation about sex and disability is basically to say people with disabilities can be sexy.
Oh, absolutely. So
it's not just it's top level sexy. It's top level sexy or functional.
I think it comes back to what is sexy, and that is in the eye of the beholder. But also, it's a lot of things that have got nothing to do with ability to stand or walk. Are you funny? Have you got a good sense of humor? Do you have a job? Can you pay your own bills?
Funny right up there.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have a bit of pep about you? When we're together, do you make me feel good? And so I think one of the questions I usually ask is, what are you looking for in a relationship? And then the person will talk about whatever it is that they're looking for. I'm like, and what do you bring to the relationship? There needs to be some sort of self-awareness here about, what is it that I can offer? A companion, a partner, a lover. And I think that kind of can change the shift of thinking too, of what is it that I bring to the table? And then once you start to articulate it, you're like, I'm a freaking catch.
As we look at how we assess people and what we look at, there's a sort of a metaphor that I always use is of sex, the act is like a tree. It's just up here. It's what you see. It's the in and out. It's whatever. It's what you're doing, but it's got roots, far-reaching roots that go deep into everything. We want to know where the messages come from and all the things like Candice just said, because all of those things inform it. And in terms of what we're trying to do in building our service is to make it multidisciplinary. So a lot of sex therapists, they work in private practice. They do fantastic work, but at Royal Rehab, what we've got is a huge MDT of allied health and rehab physicians, and everyone has specialist knowledge, and a lot of our training to health staff is around finding where within each person's specialty they can talk about sex. So example, a speech path can talk about kissing, can talk about communication and social engagement, or a doctor might look at their physical function or medical interventions and things like that. Physios are looking at their mobility, and we can apply a sex lens to every specialty in health, really, and we're trying to do that.
What is the holistic approach that you use? And
so I think we'll start with psychosexual therapy. Kind of, what is it? It's a fancy word for sex therapy, but it's also holistic. It's talk therapy, close stay on. We deliver it on telehealth like this, and then we also do it in person in clinic, and then depending on where people live and what's going on, maybe sometimes we'll do a home visit. It can be individual, it can be couples, it could be non-monogamous other structures. We're I think quite open to just working with the person and the people in their life to make sure that they're receiving the information and the intervention that they want. So psychosexual therapy is provided by either myself or Arlen. It includes an initial assessment. We usually quote, and it's about 4 hours, so just be prepared that it's over a couple of sessions. It's not like a one-off, we'll fix everything and it's no silver bullet. There's lots of questions about, sexual history, partners' practices, what they were doing before their injury, what kinds of things were happening before the injury, what's happening now. And then, it's rehab. So we have goals. And so it's kind of like, where are we headed? What do we want to be doing? And, what's an ideal outcome? Medical history as well as relationship, culture, kind of background. If there's medical issues, then we will refer that back to the rehab doctors who work beautifully with us. It's a two-way street. It's like any other part of the rehab. There's an MDT. So on our team, we've also got access to speech therapists, OT, physio. Kind of just depends on what's going on. So we don't just see people who have had a spinal cord injury. We see people who have a disability. I'd say about 40% of our caseload is spinal cord injury, but the rest is traumatic brain injury, other neurological conditions. We see a lot of people post-stroke, and then just more recently, a few more like, spina bifida, Parkinson's. I think as the word is getting out there that we're even around, people are kind of coming out of the woodwork. And there's a lot of things that are very transferable across disability diagnosis and different conditions.
If we think of the broader allied health, like if we look at OTs, we look at physios, nurses, a lot of them, they get their hands on people. They look at people. Like OTs will do a shower assessment where they watch a person shower and they see it and then they do the interventions. And so us as sex therapists, we can't watch people have sex. We don't have sex with people. We don't touch people. So it kind of that extra bit where we can get a whole lot of information really quick, we don't have direct access to that. So sometimes using employing a sex worker can be really beneficial because we can get information really quick that maybe our client can't put into words. So it can be a really valuable partnership.
And then we are also been trying to run the sexuality retreat at Sargood, and the content for that is looking pretty sweet. But COVID keeps coming and we have to keep cancelling it. So we've just had to postpone it for the second time. So we're looking to run it in April now. So it's a bit of I feel like 2021 just disappointed us all.
Just writing it off.
Yeah, it's pretty much a write-off. Just start booking 2022 up. It's a weekender, like a lot of it is some sexual skills. We work a lot with other clinicians and, sex workers and massagers and masseuses. Is that the right word? Sexological body workers. So some of it is like hands-on skills. And so we've partnered with some of that industry, but also, a lot of communication and just kind of learning about human sexual function. I mean, ultimately sex should be fun. So it's a light weekend. If you can foster friendship and fun in your relationship, then things are going to be a lot easier.
You just mentioned briefly sex workers. It might be a taboo topic for some people. For people who might feel like, oh, what? What do you say around disability and sex workers? Because obviously they bring something valuable to the process of somebody learning about their own sexual identity.
Candice, you've done a lot up to this point. I have a lot of experience with sex workers in my previous nursing work, but Candice has done a lot of back and forth with sex workers with some of our clients.
Look, I think sex work has a really important place to play in this space. It's not for everybody, and I 100% respect that. Everyone's going to have a different perspective, and again, that's going to be a message that's been subliminally put into people's minds about how they feel about sex work. I think we're in a unique position in New South Wales where sex work's decriminalised. That in itself is fantastic. Sex work's real work. That's kind of my personal stance on it. In terms of the rehab space, I feel like they offer a very unique service that if people need hands-on help, like sometimes we'll be working with someone, we can talk about it till the cows come home, but they actually need someone to put their hands on that person and help them feel that, like it's a real somatic sort of embodied experience of like, how does that feel for you? Full disclosure, Alan and I aren't going to touch anybody. So it's kind of like, that's outside of our scope. you can think of sex work in kind of two ways. One is like, I went to have a really good time and it was relaxing and that was enjoyable and that was fun and that's great and that's the end of it. Or you can think of it like sexual surrogacy. And so this is sort of maybe more about what we're doing in terms of the partnering with some of our colleagues. And that is like, I have a goal, I have a very specific sexual goal that I want to work on. I want to become a better lover. I want to be able to do something specifically better. I want to see how my body responds, without medication. And I'm a bit scared to do that with somebody. And because it could be a failure or it could not be. And I just kind of want that professional interaction. So if it's a goal-based learning, I guess the way I approach it, and others might be doing it a bit differently, is I'll talk to the person about, what was your experience with sex work before your injury? Have you ever seen a sex worker? Yes or no? And it's like, is this something that you might be open to? Because we have a whole range of colleagues, depending on where it is that somebody lives, who have training in disability as well. And it's just a professional service that if somebody wanted to explore, we would make that partnership and that link. But, because you have this specific goal, if you don't mind, I'd probably give her or him a ring before your appointment. I'd do like an introduction, so that way it's kind of a bit seamless, and help them sort of facilitate that first booking as well, especially if it's someone's first time. And then I would probably say to the sex worker, this is what the person's working on, this is what their goal is. They want to try this particular product, or they want to have this hands-on kind of experience and work out how it is that they can then communicate that to another lover. And then afterwards, I usually get some feedback. I get some feedback from the client about how that went. And then with the client's permissions, the sex worker will ring me as well and say, this worked, that didn't work, this needs to be modified. And because we have access to all the Allied Health, it might be like, yep, that vibrator worked, but they could not hold it in their hand long enough to be able to finish the job. So you need to have some OT do something to it. And so it's especially for we see a lot of people who are nonverbal as well. So for clients who are nonverbal, this is perfect, because then they can explicitly say, this worked, this didn't work, this is what next needs to happen. And it's a lot quicker than typing it through comms boards. And then I can come back to my session with the client and say, I spoke to your sex worker, how did it go for you? And so then we can start to problem solve whatever the problem was.
So this can often be a question with if we're advocating with families to allow a disabled family member to go and see a sex worker. Often the family want to know if the sex worker's trained in disability and things like that. So people who have done training with touching base, that can kind of be a bit of a carrot for us to encourage the family to support it. And pleasure, enjoyment, fun.
It was really interesting when you were talking about sex toys and functionality and sex workers, because that's probably not something people actually think about as part of going to see a sex worker, part of the exploration process. What sort of training do sex workers have when it comes to disability?
Sex workers aren't held up by AFRA's recommendation. There's no standards of sex workers have to do X, Y, and Z to be able to work in the disability space. It's unregulated in that regard. But there is an organisation called Touching Base, and they do provide education and training and disability awareness for folks who are in the sex work space that want to upskill, real practical things like manual handling kind of stuff, and undressing and redressing and kind of, what do you do if someone has a bowel accident? What do you do if someone has a bladder accident? And just kind of normalise a lot of that stuff. And so the industry is better prepared to support people with a disability. But I wouldn't necessarily say you have to see a sex worker who has had disability training. If you saw a sex worker before and they knew you before your injury and you want to go back and see them again, they'll work it out. They're professionals. But at the same time, if you were thinking, I'd really like to make sure that the person sort of knew a little bit, then you can go to Touching Base and they have a list of sex workers who have done their training.
So because I guess, everything we've spoken about today is obviously about making sure you have agency over your own sexuality. Whereas, some of the conversations I've had growing up have been very practical, right? So you can still get pregnant. Orgasms wasn't even a part of that, or, whatever. Yeah, it was just 100% fertility. I've really only started having this conversation with other people, just generally in our lives, in the past couple of years. So I guess, where has it been this whole time?
Well, I think that comes back to my original point of societies, I think, a little bit more sex positive, or a little bit more willing and able to have these open conversations. I kind of say, people have sex for 5 reasons, that there's like 5 basic purposes. Procreation is one. And so I kind of say, you know, is that what the goal, is that what the issue is? The person's like, no. I'm like, cool, we'll take that off the table. And then we can just like talk about the other 4. And so I think sometimes people, particularly in rehab too, you know, if you want to have a family and you're worried that your family, you know, your family planning options are now completely disrupted, that can cause a lot of distress. So we really do need to make sure that the folks have good understanding about what their fertility options are. But if the family planning's over, if you were never interested in it anyway, you got to close that story off to focus on the other more important parts of the story.
What are the other 4 points?
So people will have, for, you know, stress release, stress management. Like, you know, a lot of people will have a wank and go to sleep. That's kind of what they've done before their injury, and then now they're like, oh, I can't, I'm not sleeping as well. And you kind of unpack that a little bit more, and it's like, oh, how else do you manage your stress? Bonding and intimacy, like, you know, just plays an important part in people's relationships. Self-esteem, sort of how they see themselves. So, Alan, if I, as a female with a spinal cord injury, have a high-level injury and it's my first sexual experience post-injury, what's sort of some of the mental prep work that you think I need to do as well as the physical prep work?
So I guess the very first thing I looked at, which I talked about before, was finding what feels good and where you can feel and what you can feel, and exploring that. The second part is trying to get rid of any perceived goals, which is again unpacking our societal expectations of how sex should be. So starting to look at what's underneath, like the reason we're there. What do we get out of this? Do we get closeness? Do we get a bit of fun? Do we get a bit of touch? What are we wanting out of it, rather than are we gonna just try and, you know, fast track to orgasm? Because that orgasm might not happen. So some of the more goal-oriented expectations we want to kind of get rid of, and just sort of do it in a bit more of a mindful, in the moment type of experience. I guess if someone's had an injury and it's their first time having sex, we kind of want to control for some of the problems that might pop up. So if they have a lot of spasms, maybe we want to look at some positioning options to mitigate that. If they have a lot of pain, are we going to look at how they're doing their pain medication or other things like positioning to work with that? What happens if pain comes up? Maybe their pain medication is going to affect their function. So we just need to be aware of these things that can come up. Further to that, then we want to think of maybe if there's problems with continence, things like that, how do we deal with that? So it's a bit of troubleshooting, like how do we deal with some of the things that might come up during it? So we're covering those bases, but in terms of goals and what we want to achieve, we want to look at kind of expanding it, and like doing sex for the sake of sex. Take away hoping to achieve an orgasm. We want to just work on enjoying it and being in the moment.
And I think it's important here that we just stop for a second, because when Alan's talking about sex, he's not talking about penetrative receptive sex. He's talking about vulnerability and being naked, or just being close with another person or with yourself. I think sometimes we can misunderstand when we're talking about sex, we're talking about penetration. And more often than not, we're not.
We might not want penetration. So then that's that question we unpack. What does sex look like? Or what can it look like? What's possible?
All of this kind of feeds into the wider misconception of sex anyway.
It's very simple, and it puts you into a box, or like, this is what we have to do, and if we can't do that, then we can't do sex. But everyone can do sex.
I usually check in people. So are you sharing a bed right now? Like, you know, if I'm working with a couple, kind of what's your setup? Because it's amazing how many people get discharged with like a single hospital bed, and then there's that environmental barrier as well. And then if people are discharged with a partner bed, it's like, okay, so are you going to bed at the same time? Because sometimes people are going to bed at like, you know, 8 o'clock at night, and somebody else is coming to bed at midnight, and it's just sort of a mismatch. You know, it's kind of talking about privacy and space, and what does togetherness look like, and even just how's the relationship going? Like, that's an important part. And I think in acquired injury, like later in life, you have to deal with grief and loss. Like, this is a grief space. They've got to reinvent themselves in every aspect of their life, including who they are as a sexual being. And I think if you try to skim over that and think that that's not part of it, then you've sort of missed And I think that depends on how long down the track you're seeing people, because ultimately that adjustment story, like how people are experiencing their own adjustment journey, will completely set them up for how they see themselves sexually and how much they want to explore sex post-injury. And my observation is the better someone's adjustment, the better sexual exploration and how much pleasure they kind of allow themselves to have as well. You know, it's like a permission, self-permission.
There's often a lot of holding on to what it was before. And we want it to be exactly the same as it was before. And I mean, that's a goal. Like, I mean, we can work towards bringing that in, but often people sort of have a new body in a way. And, you know, when we were first having sex, we were discovering our body and we were figuring out what worked and what we liked. And we almost have to do that again in a way. We can kind of hold on to what people liked before, but sometimes we need to change things or find new things. So it's learning a new way.
Obviously, communication becomes a huge thing, right? And so I guess there could be situations where people have had sex in a previous life and just had sex. And now there has to be a massive conversation about communication. Maybe if it was because they have a partner that's been with them pre-injury to now post-injury. This is actually a common theme that we have in a lot of our podcast episodes, just the actual enhancement of communication that you now need to make. And obviously that doesn't stop with sex as well.
Well, I think sex is a form of communication, right? So if you think about how is it that you say you're sorry, do you say I'm sorry, or do you kind of fucking make up? Like that I think is sex. Important. Sorry for swearing on your podcast. No,
that's fine.
But I do think it kind of says, okay, well, if that's how we communicated before and we never actually said the words, I'm sorry and I forgive you, then if you take that ability to just make up physically and the two of you understand what that means, I think that can really change the dynamic of your relationship. If you haven't learned how to say, I'm sorry, I forgive you, and the previous communication of I'm sorry and I forgive you has changed, you can kind of find yourselves in like conflict cycles.
The sex communication, there's like this across the board, able-bods too, is like there's a lot of fumbling in the dark, and this is also where things like consent fall apart, is because people don't say what they want, people don't ask to do things, because we're all just like zipped. We don't say anything, and
it's very Australian.
Yeah.
Silent lovers.
We'll sort of just figure it out. And then really neither person's happy, or maybe one person's happy, but that communication's not happening. So better communication, regardless of your function, is going to make sex better, because you're going to get what you want and what you enjoy, and you're going to meet your partner's needs, and it's going to be more safe because you're communicating. I guess what I was talking about before with sort of controlling for things that might come up, problems that might pop up during sex, you really don't know what's going to happen until you do it. And you have to be able to communicate. If something does come up during sex, if a problem does arise, then you need to be able to say, okay, this isn't working, or that hurts, or oops, we've made a mess, let's clean it up. You need to be able to talk about that to get through it and to enjoy it.
I see somebody, who came to me and said, I want to know everything so that way I can feel like I'm prepared to go into a relationship. And I was like, okay, like, well, what's your experience been so far? He's like, well, none. And it's like, oh, well, straight up, I'm like, that's okay. I can tell you kind of theoretically, like, about spinal injury and the impact it has on lubrication, arousal, erectile function. Like, you know, we can do that whole speech, but sometimes you just got to get on the horse. Like, you just got to ride and give it a go, and then we've got something to work with. So even if you try and it's not fabulous and you go, that was awkward, well, we've got a baseline. But I think, when people want to know everything, they want to be able to prepare and plan for everything. It's like, that's really hard. Just start by lying with your partner. Like, I know the amount of people that I've worked with, I'm like, have you had a chance just to be together? And it's like, oh, and that first time of just lying together, like stroking each other's back and just chatting, having some pillow talk, it's like, oh, this is really nice, this is intimate, this is nice. It's like,
sex is messy, sex is awkward, it's not always perfect, and I think when you're trying to get all of the knowledge know everything that can possibly happen, control for every possible problem. You're really sort of, it's almost like a perfectionism that's happening. You need to allow mistakes to happen, allow messes to happen, allow fumbling and falling and tripping and pinching or hair pulling to happen by accident, because that's what happens. But it's being fluid and open to that.
Do you also work with couples as well, and one might be able-bodied and the other one might have already acquired a spinal cord injury? And so just out of curiosity, there's obviously a path there for them as well, not focus on the past but bring a new life to them as well, and a new kind of learning experience. Do you find that able-bodied partners are, I guess, willing to come to the table enthusiastically, or is there some hesitation, or what's your experience?
So far, the clients I've seen, you do see some where the able-bodied partner is frustrated and things like that, but a lot of the time it's the person with the spinal cord injury who's really worried that they're not satisfying their partner, and their partner goes, "Oh, I'm fine," or maybe the partner's enjoying it, but they're worried that the spinal injured partner is not able to enjoy it as much as they can. So there's sort of this. Often they really kind of want each other to really enjoy it.
I guess some of the ways that we would do this clinically, Susan, is kind of in game form. So we'll talk a lot about, how is it that I want to touch you? And then how is it that you want to touch me? Because it's two different things. And more often than not, we're thinking, when I say, how would you like to touch me? Straight away, the partner's usually thinking, how would she like me to touch her? Because then I'll do that way. Like, rather than actually, the question was, how would you like to touch me? And that is much more like internalized. Thinking about your own pleasure. Like, am I touching because I want to touch, I don't know, maybe I've always been fascinated with your hair and I want to rub your hair, but I'm so busy thinking, would you like me to touch your hair, that I don't touch your hair? So it's like, okay, let's just come back to the actual question, which is, how would you like to touch me and how would I like to touch you? Because then we're kind of learning this sort of ability to give and receive touch without necessarily thinking all the time about the partner, what they want, trying to guess it, and then actually not allowing our own pleasure because we're too busy focused on what it is that we should be performing and doing.
What does each person want, or what is each person happy with? So you kind of, you see this a lot in sex. You see, for example, women that can't get orgasm. We've got the orgasm gap. And a lot of sexual problems come from performance anxiety. So in women, a lot of the time that performance anxiety manifests in a difficulty reaching orgasm, and that can be often, if they're heterosexual especially, pressure from the man, because the man desperately wants his female partner to have an orgasm, and they're pushing for it, and that puts pressure on the woman, and she can't orgasm. What does each person want from themselves, and what are they happy for? It's accepting that, what each other's getting out of it, and that being enough.
So is there anything that I've missed that you would like to discuss, even if they have never met anybody with a disability? Because let's be honest, they might want to date somebody with a disability later on down the track. Is there something that you want to put out there?
I would say be prepared that it might be different. It might be different to an able-bodied person, but that does not ever mean that they can't give pleasure and that they can't receive pleasure. It's just that it might be different, and we need to be open-minded. If we like the person and we're attracted to the person, well then we can work on it. We can be creative. Yeah, you have to be creative and open-minded sometimes. And if you want it, you'll find it somewhere.
And each generation is seeing sex therapists at higher rates. I think the younger generation coming through, I saw this article in the Sydney Morning Herald the other day talking about Gen X and Gen Y coming through, saying no more shame, no more lack of education, skills, and just kind of deal with all of that shame around sex. And I think that's, that's pretty much what Alan and I are offering. There's a whole sex tech movement, which is our fancy way of saying, the technology that is available. Some people call them sex toys, we would call them adaptive aids, but I think that whole space has got a lot to offer our community, and in terms of how it is that we support people with sensory changes, particularly upper limb dysfunction. Like there's a lot of great options for how people might modify, tweak, change, and still be able to self-pleasure.
There's a lot of great products out there that we already like to use, that we're finding that our clients really love to use. But there's also a lot of sex toy companies that are starting to develop products specifically with people with disability in mind. So it's a really huge and interesting...
Basically start a new sexual revolution for people with disabilities.
We're in the midst of one. The whole sex positivity movement happening. I mean, we had it back in the 60s and 70s, and then it kind of fell off a little bit for a number of reasons. But in the last few years, there's been a huge amount of sexuality. We're seeing a lot of companies making products. We're seeing a lot of sexuality influencers. A lot of sex therapists and sexologists are very active on social media. Lots of podcasts. It's really growing.
You've been listening to Have the Nerve, a podcast by Spinal Cord Injuries Australia. If you'd like to know more about anything we've spoken about, please check the show notes at the bottom of this episode. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, please consider giving us a 5-star review. Your review will help us get more people to listen to the show. And finally, if you're on social media, why not send us over some love? We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Thank you for listening.